This is a question from a voter in Rochester, and this is directed to Jackie Cilley. And Fenton, you'll have time to respond if you like. In a Rochester Times article, you praised the Canadian government's involvement in business and said we'd call it socialism. Are you suggesting such a system for the United States? And you have 3 minutes.
No, and I've been accused of this on, all of the Republican blogs, and my opponent has managed to foster this. First of all, let me tell you, and I know I did an interview with you, Mike, with Tom Blaze from Rokon, whose largest dealer network is in Canada. I went to Canada at the invitation of the Canadian government, primarily to discuss trade issues. 32,700 jobs in New Hampshire depend on trade with Canada. $7.7 billion of trade back and forth to Canada. One of our largest groups that come down to, for tourism in the state of New Hampshire, which I just cited as being our second largest industry, is from Canada. Right over the border, there are 8 million people in Quebec. Half of the population of Somersworth and Rochester have Canadian heritage roots. I have the deep pleasure of going and visiting, and I'm going to mutilate this, so forgive me if anybody's listening, Club Unité Française next week to talk about that trip to Canada. What I said in the paper, now whether I said it artfully or whether the reporter got it quite right, but it sure has been taken out of context. I said what intrigued me is how the Canadians love their government. I'm from New Hampshire. I'm not borrowing anything. I'm not borrowing anything from Minnesota, which has is among the 10th worst states in the country for their budget. I'm not borrowing anything. But I was intrigued by how they felt about their government. They thought we were really silly about this whole debate about health care. It intrigued me. It's that intellectual curiosity. What can I tell you? But there was no attempt to borrow those big government ideas. I was surprised that they knew what they paid for taxes. They seemed genuinely happy with it. And I made the foolish mistake of telling a reporter, they say, don't get caught at an honest moment, right? And that's what happened. So thank you for the opportunity, whoever asked that question, to let me get that on the record, because that was what that was all about. Harvard Industry ships their windows to Canadian company on modular homes. Our businesses depend on that trade. And Tom Blaze, as you may recall on the WTSN show, talked about how absolutely critical it was, and that it's time to be a little enlightened about what our trade means, and especially with our nearest neighbor.
Thank you for that response. And Fenton, we'll let you respond or comment on that.
Jackie, I'm glad that you clarified your article, your comments from that, and I hope that you were misquoted from what you said there. I agree with you that trade with Canada is an area we'd completely agree with. It's essential. Much of the lumber that we use to build homes, most of the lumber that we use to build homes comes from Canada. And so I would agree that is very essential. I just want to comment very briefly on a previous statement that was made, how a person who's pro-life can be in favor of the death penalty. In the case of the death penalty, it is very, very restricted to those who have willfully taken the life of another. In the case of being pro-life regarding children, it's regarding completely innocent little boys and girls who have the misfortune of not being wanted. They are little boys and girls. They are human beings. I don't think the two even begin to compare.
All right, our next question is from a voter in Rochester, and this one is directed to Fenton, and Jackie will have an opportunity to respond or comment if she likes. Fenton, to what extent or in what ways does the quality of life in the United States depend upon how we deal with traditional family values?
I believe that to a very large degree, our nation is we are who we are because of who we came from and where we came from. Our values started way before our Constitution was written. They're rooted in Judeo-Christian ethics. I am not an exclusivist that I say that we can only have Judeo-Christians or Judeo-Christian ethics in our government. But I do believe that those are solid values. They were what our nation was founded on. Our Constitution, many experts agree, our Constitution was founded on values that were Judeo-Christian values. We have an excellent society and culture as a result of that tradition. And I think it's very important that we maintain that. I had mentioned earlier, and just talked about it in the last comment, that I am pro-life. It's because of that, because I believe that we ought to be protecting the lives of these little children. I think marriage is a fundamental structure of our society. And by the way, I don't believe that we should get into people's bedrooms and be concerned or have legislation that affects what people do in their bedrooms. I don't agree with that. But when we try to institutionalize that in our laws, I do disagree with that. So the values are very important, and I personally hold to very strong family values. I mentioned before, I have 7 children, 6 grandchildren. Family is very important to me, and I want to keep those values strong. Family values are very important for our society and our culture.
And I'll repeat the question once again, Jackie. To what extent?
I heard it,
Okay,
Mike,
very good.
so I'm fine with it.
All right.
I guess I get a little lost when I hear my opponent talk about families and then talk about traditional families, because, you know, I look around, and when I go around District 6, I've met families of every type. You know, there are single moms raising children. There are single dads raising children. There are women who care enough to take care of one another and to pledge not only their property, but their well-being with one another. There are men that do the same thing. Our families come in a wide variety of mixtures. And whether you want to call those traditional or not, they're wonderful and they're beautiful, and they add to the quality of our life. You know, I listened to an interview last evening on one of the more progressive stations, and just so that everybody knows, I actually watch Fox sometimes, the Fair and Balanced station, but I watch them all. But this one, I just want to be honest, this one came from one of those really wild liberal shows. But what got me is, you know, it was Rachel Maddow, you can all guess, right? It's either got to be her or Keith Olbermann, or that really wild man, Lawrence O'Donnell. But you know, she was interviewing a serviceman. And, you know, they were talking about the whole don't ask, don't tell. And this fellow had been in a long-term committed relationship. And they took care of one another. And he went overseas he was shipped out to Afghanistan. While he was gone, his partner was taken to the hospital and put on the table, and they actually almost lost him, and they had to revive him. There was no way for this serviceman to allow his partner to know that he had been injured or killed. There was no way for his partner to allow him to know that he had almost died. There was no way for him to get leave so that he could come back to somebody that he loved and he cared for and he cherished. There are all kinds of families out there. Do they add to the quality of our life? You bet they do. But when we start getting restrictive, and we start saying that because the Unitarian Church recognizes your union, but the Methodist Church doesn't recognize your union, when we start getting that restrictive, we began to lose the quality of our life. We began to lose the humanity that we are, and we began to lose the society that this is. And this is, by the way, quite rightfully so, the live free or die state.
Thank you for that response.